September 30th, Lewis Hayden.
Circumstances can drag a man down, but God-given dignity can lift him up. In 1811, Lewis Hayden was born a slave to a family of 25 in Lexington, Kentucky. Not an ideal situation. While he had family members all around him, life for a child slave was not safe. Lewis was property, like a dog or a hamster is property. If slave children were disobedient or showed any kind of free spirit at all, they could be beaten just like adult slaves. Their owners did not see them as human beings, just things to be used. His father was sold off first, and Lewis knew that at any time he could be sold too, or his mother or his siblings. This molded Lewis's firm belief that he was only worth what someone was willing to pay for him. When Lewis was 10, it finally happened. His owner sold all of Lewis's family to different slaveholders and traded Lewis to a traveling salesman for 2 horse carriages. In one instant, Lewis lost his entire family. He was left alone, a young slave. Not much sense of self-worth after that. Not much of anything to cling to. When he was 14, an American Revolutionary War soldier visited Kentucky, and one day he strolled past Lewis and he tipped his hat. What to most would have been a simple nod, a smile, a gesture, to Lewis Hayden, it was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. Someone acknowledged him as if he were a human being, a person, not a slave, not a piece of property, but a young man. This simple gesture from a total stranger sparked something in Lewis. For the first time in life, he recognized his own value. Not just that, but the value his Father in heaven had for him. He was of worth in God's eyes. He clung to that. Not that Lewis's troubles magically disappeared. They didn't. He was still a slave, but he was a slave who, with that simple acknowledgement, began to change. He now had a belief in himself as a man. This stayed with him. A few years later, he approached Lewis Baxter, an insurance office clerk, and Thomas Grant, an oil manufacturer, and asked if they would buy him and hire him to make money for them and let him keep some of his earnings to eventually buy his own freedom. The men accepted, and Lewis was hired out as a waiter at the Phoenix Hotel in Lexington. And now, knowing his own value as a man, he worked hard and began to save for his own freedom. Then in 1844, Lewis, still a slave working at the hotel and now married with a stepson, both of them slaves, and fearing his family could be separated, met another man who loved God. A Methodist minister involved in the Underground Railroad, Lewis asked the pastor to help them escape. The minister asked Lewis, "Why do you want your freedom?" Lewis replied, "Because I am a man." No longer a slave, a man, the minister agreed to help Lewis and his family escape via the Underground Railroad. It is amazing when a man finally recognizes his own worth, gains self-respect, and how it can affect the lives of others. In Jeremiah 29:11, God tells us, "I know the plans I have in mind for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for peace, not disaster, to give you a future filled with hope." Many men, like you, may feel like a slave to their circumstances. When Lewis Hayden saw himself through God's eyes, it changed his life and the lives of those around him. What is keeping you from seeing yourself through God's eyes? Circumstances can drag a man down, but God-given dignity can lift him up.
And Chuck Stecker here with the Chosen Generation and also one of the narrators for 365. You know, I look at this story of Lewis Hayden, September 30th. What a great story. You know, there's so many different stories just in this one story, isn't there? But let me just kind of focus on a couple of things that grab me in the process and see what the challenge is for me and see if there's a challenge here for you. You know, one of the first things that jumped out at me as I read this story, I narrated this story, was patience. You know, we always say, be careful what you pray for because God will have to put you through stuff to get it. Patience is one of those, isn't it? God, give me patience. And you know you're going to be tested in order to learn that. But I see patience in Lewis Hayden. I see a trust there, but I see patience there. You know, it wasn't demanding this step, everything change and so forth. He looked for the opportunities along the way, along the journey, more concerned about the journey and what God was doing, and he would learn that later. But here's the other thing, and I identified with this, although I've never been a physical slave here on earth. Well, haven't I, though? You know, was the idea that with Lewis Hayden, our story tells us that he was born a slave. He became an escaped slave. He bought his way out, and then he would help other slaves and other escaped slaves. You know, one of the things that I think we have to see as men, if you know Jesus Christ, and the life that we're trying to live is, weren't we all born into slavery until we came to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ? I mean, we were, weren't we? We were slaves to sin. We were slaves to everything else. In fact, our master was ourself, which meant our master that we were a slave to was really Satan, wasn't it? Until we realized that we had been purchased, right, from that life and set free. And you know, with Lewis Hayden, he realized that, and a former slave then devoted his life to helping other slaves and escaped slaves. You know, if you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you know, like me, perhaps we have to acknowledge we're escaped slaves. We have been purchased for a price, haven't we? And maybe, just maybe, isn't our responsibility to help other slaves and escaped slaves find their way to Jesus Christ? That's exactly what God is calling us to do. Who do you know that's a slave right now that could use an escaped slave, you, to help them find their own freedom? God bless you.